Welcome to part 3 of building the Enraged Rabbit Carrot Feeder V2. In this video, we're focusing on the selector and the encoder. Here I'm starting by cleaning up the support material from the selector cart. In addition to that little strip, there are 3 numbered tabs, and they pop out quite easily. Then we need to insert the linear bearings. These are very definitely press fit. You can try using a bolt and some washers. I actually didn't have a washer large enough to properly do this. And so I ended up using a woodworking vise. I could not show that to you. I apologize, but they press fit fairly easily. Next come the heat set inserts. Then comes this deep heat set insert. This one's really kind of tricky because you can't see what's going on in terms of is it flush or not. Um, and I think I pushed it just a little bit too far and the hole got clogged with plastic with ABS. And so here I'm running a through screw to make sure it's all cleaned out. And then comes the cable chain mount. And then we mount the mount. Next, we need to install the small magnet. Here I'm using some super glue, although chances are good that this press fit works. In my case, it did. It's a fairly, it's a very tight fit, and I ended up not using the super glue. Next, we need to mount the servo. For that, you need these 4 self-threading screws that come in this kit. Also, this mount, I'm using the one labeled Savox, which I think is correct. And, well, you'll see later, I'm able to attach it and fit it just fine using this. But here, I'm wondering, do I have the right mount? Here I've got the 12 by 6 millimeter spring with the spring cap attached, and it goes into that hole where we had the really, really deep heat set insert. And here you can see how the servo will fit in with the spring and the screw underneath it to adjust tension. Then you'll need to install the second screw as well. And then you'll need to tie down the servo cable. And there's a spot here just for this purpose. Simple. And now we prep the encoder housing with heat set inserts. Next, we assemble the encoder and make sure the extruder gear that you use is the one that uses the precision bearings, if you're using the same kit I am. And then this gets pushed down all the way onto the teeth, so it looks like this. So here I'm test fitting it into the housing. I'm inserting it. You may have to release a brake. There's actually a brake on this housing, which is the bottom portion, which is flexible like so. And so when you pull it back and this is inserted, the chopper should be pretty much flushed with the surface. It should spin freely. And then when you release the brake, it should not. Here I'm inserting the optical center, really test fitting it at this stage, and just making sure that it fits properly on that 3D printed chopper and it can turn. And here I'm bolting it down. And testing again, make sure it can turn properly when the brake is released. And then I'm attaching the other side of the housing. Then this V-bearing gets inserted and bolted in as well. After that, we need to install the compression fitting. So I'm loosening the screws I just tightened just a little bit, and that'll allow this compression fitting to fit in easier, like so. And then you can tighten it down. And then here I'm testing it with a piece of filament to make sure the filament path works as intended. And now we install the encoder. Now we need to install the door. And here I'm attaching the magnet to the magnet on the carriage to make sure I get the polarity correct here. So here I'm just test fitting the door. I'm going to squeeze a little bit to make sure that magnet is stuck onto the door, and that way I can be sure the polarity is correct. And I'm going to force it in here a little extra harder. If you want, you should probably use some super glue. And then here I'm taking a piece of filament, which will act as the hinge. Sorry, the video got cut off there a little bit, but as you can see, the filament is fed all the way through. Then taking my side cutters, trimming it flush. And we now have a working door. So now the belt tensioner needs to be installed. And it simply has this little track here where it slides in. And then the M3 bolt. I'm tightening here, but you should keep it a little looser. So now we move on to assembling the linear axis. I'm going to save you from having to watch me insert these heat set inserts, but trust me, they'll be installed. So here I'm installing the cable chain mount to the motor mount. So now we can install the stepper motor. And it simply slides in. And there's this motor shim. It pops in place. And then the 4 bolts. Then we assemble the linear axis idler. There's the end cap, the idler, the lock nut, and now we assemble the linear axis. Of course, we need our steel rods, we need some grease for these linear bearings. If someone knows of a better way to grease these bearings, please post a link or add some comments to the comment sections of this video. I ended up doing this repeatedly, and there's 4 tracks internally of ball bearings, and I really couldn't figure out much else to do other than try to squeeze it in as best I can, and then use the steel shaft to try and force it in, which kind of worked a little bit. Again, if you've got a better method, please post. Once the bearings are lubricated, you can insert the shafts and add this idler end cap. It might take a little bit of persuasion, like I'm doing here. Check the holes on the bottom to make sure the shafts are all the way in, and this will become important later. Make sure they're all the way in. Here I've inserted the motor mount, and again, make sure these shafts are all the way in. And you see me here inserting these screws. These can be used for adjustment, which we'll use in a little while. And here I'm installing the drive pulley. I'm not making this really tight. We'll probably do a couple adjustments when we get the belt on. So we're going to assemble all of this. And so here I'm inserting the M5 lock nuts. And as you can see, I've got the M5 bolts here as well. And I'm inserting the M5 lock nuts on the base as well, as we will be connecting these two together. And here I'm just inserting screws. This is essentially a big hinge, and it needs to go through. There's one screw on one side and then the second on the other. And when you're holding it like this, those lock nuts that I inserted before sometimes drop out. So I had to futz around with it a little bit, but it did work. And then here I'm getting the other side. Next, we need to adjust the idler position. And if you take a look here, there are these bumps, and they should align or sit right on the bumps that are over here. So you do need to open up the clamps so you can sit this down, and notice it doesn't align. It's not sitting flat because of the bumps not aligning. And then you can use the screws here. In fact, you need to use the screws here to make minor adjustments, and it pushes the rods out until these align, and then it sits properly. And then once it does, you can tighten the clamps down. And then one more check to make sure this works. It's sliding okay, everything's looking smooth. Here I've inserted one side of the belt in the selector. And then here, trying to feed it through the idler. And the proper way to do this is to open the clamps. And then once you do, you can lift this up and feed the belt through properly. And then here I'm deciding where I want to cut and getting my flush cutters. And I actually ended up cutting this a little bit too loose. In a minute or so, I'll trim it once more. And you can, of course, tighten the screw to tighten the belt tension. Still a little bit too loose here, and you should check the drive pulley as well too and make sure it seems aligned. But again, here I'm opening it up because I'm going to cut a little bit more off. When you adjust the drive pulley, make sure you use some thread locker. That way it won't work itself loose later. But if everything looks aligned, you should be good. Once that's done, we need to move the wiring, or at least tie it down. And that's the wire for the servo. And then here we've also got the wire that comes around from the encoder. And so remember there was that little pathway that had support in it much earlier that we had to clean out of the print from the selector block. And so these wires will simply run through that. I really despise wiring, and this was a lot of trouble for me. Not quite sure why. It's really not that hard. Just feed the wire through the channel. And I decided to skip most of it because it's just so not interesting. But once you get it through the channel, then we can unline these so we can tie these down with the tie wrap. And I'm probably going to have to go back and do a little better job, but this works for now. Then the cable chain needs to get installed. Here you can see I already attached the top. I ran the wires, the encoder wires, through the chain. And it's kind of an interesting cable chain here because they don't snap open and close like the ones I've dealt with in the past. There's a little trough, I guess, so to speak, where you can run the wires through, which is actually kind of nice. Again, wiring isn't one of my strengths. This will get better later. If you found this video useful, please click subscribe, and thank you for watching.